Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Amy, for helping us today in this important workshop. Again, my name's Eric Berman. I'm a partner with Eide Bailly in our Boise office, and with me today is Kurt Schlicker. He's a partner in our Reno office. Between us, we've probably spent way too many hours in the past 2 years plus with the various COVID federal acts, including the American Rescue Plan Act and now the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. Now, that last one has been a little bit slow to get started, but certainly for many of you, it will ramp up quickly, especially if you're in a transportation department or function. Between us, we really are the subject matter experts for these acts for Eide Bailly. Let's see if this will go today. Come on. There we go. Okay, today's agenda will be a quick walkthrough of where we've been in the various federal acts, and then we're going to focus on ARPA. As I like to say, 10 times for the normal mind, 100 times under stress, and oh boy, are we under stress right now. I'll give you a quick reminder of the 4 eligible use categories, and then Kurt and I are going to walk you through the various aspects in the final rule, including many of the frequently asked questions that we've been receiving over the past year plus. I'll then take us home on a few reminders of ARPA information and reporting it, and provide a quick overview of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, that will prove to be really crucial for many governments across the country. Again, the focus of that one is to improve horizontal infrastructure and other assets in your jurisdiction. So to get us started, to paraphrase the Grateful Dead song, and actually I'm going to stop my video because I'm using a lot of bandwidth here. So here we go. Okay, to paraphrase the Grateful Dead song, what a long, strange trip it has been over the last 2 years in the federal grant world. All of us have had something to do with over $5 trillion in your and my tax money, responding in some way to the pandemic. Now, if you think about 5 trillion, you say, oh, 5 trillion isn't what it used to be. Let's put that in perspective. Norwich University, which is a military institute in Vermont, calculated the inflation-adjusted cost of the wars that the United States has been involved with since 1900. The most expensive war, of course, was World War II. From 1941 through 1945, defense spending during World War II was $4.1 trillion in 2020 inflation-adjusted dollars, per the study by the university, including saving the world from tyranny and unleashing the atomic age. In the last 2 years, Congress has approved $900 million more than World War II cost in pandemic response and to modernize our infrastructure. Now, back in the early days of COVID, back in the dark ages, Congress passed the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. And the bill provided $8.3 billion in emergency funding for federal agencies to respond to the recent outbreak. Funding was mainly for HHS and CDC to get those vaccines going and to acquire PPE, and the funds also went to the Small Business Administration for loan guarantees. Now, to put again that in perspective, those funds were exhausted in less than 2 weeks. Another $192 billion was passed that same month in March of 2020, and that was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or FFCRA. That act continued funding for vaccine research and production, again to HHS and CDC, and the country bought tons of PPE out of it. It also expanded paid leave and unemployment compensation. But of course, the country needed more. And 1 week after FFCRA, that's when the CARES Act was passed. And we talked about this last year, but just again, for those of you who weren't part of state and local government or weren't part of federal grants back last year, that was a massive infusion of $2.2 trillion. And it involved loans, grants, tax credits, vaccine production, PPE, and so many other things. We all thought that the $150 billion just to state and local governments was a tremendous number. Of course, as Lieutenant Commander Montgomery Scott from Star Trek said in one of the movies, how quaint. And 1 month after the CARES Act, the Paycheck Protection Program and the Health Enhancement Act was passed, adding funds to the PPP program, adding funds to the Economic Injury Disasters Loan Programs, and it also gave $25 billion in an initial funding and a COVID test kit purchase. The PPP program got added flexibility and unfortunately added fraud. Forgiveness provisions. There was a supplemental act passed in June of 2020. After that, Congress took a rest for about 6 months. After all, they were running for re-election. And one of the last acts of Congress in 2020 was to allow for flexibility and COVID relief, but it also added $2.3 trillion to shore up the ongoing deficits in all the COVID programs. And that was just in 2020. Today, we're going to talk about the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, and that was passed in March of 2021, just a little over a year ago, providing an additional $1.9 trillion with 4 focus areas. And then Kurt and I are going to provide an overview of these areas over the next hour or so. Okay, come on. All right, so let's take a quick tour of ARPA and the implementation of the so-called final rule. Now, during May of 2021, the U.S. Treasury issued an interim final rule so that state and local governments, as well as other recipients of ARPA funds, could get started in implementing ARPA. The IFR, as it was known, had specific questions that the U.S. Treasury asked stakeholders regarding the implementation of the fiscal recovery funds. And that had a goal of receiving public input, providing transparency and accountability. Now, the IFR described eligible and ineligible uses of funds, as well as other program provisions. And based on those provisions, governments began to distribute the funds. Now, the IFR went immediately into effect last May, and since then, governments have used fiscal recovery funds to meet their immediate pandemic response needs and begin building a strong and equitable recovery, such as through vaccine incentives, development of affordable housing, construction of infrastructure to deliver safe and reliable water. Now, whenever someone asks a question, answers are usually received. And Treasury received over 1,500 responses to these specific questions, in addition to roundtable meetings with grantees and questions from webinars that they received and other feedback. Treasury took all that information into consideration, and they provided the final rule that was issued about 60 days ago. Now, both the interim final rule and the final rule, or FR, focus on the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds within ARPA, which many call the FRF. The FRF is a $350 billion program for states, municipalities, tribal nations, territories, and other governments targeting COVID-19 response and recovery. The 4 basic goals of ARPA continue to be in the final rule, which gives needed clarity to those goals. And as we discussed last year in a webinar, the goals are to fight the pandemic and support families and businesses struggling with the public health and economic impacts of COVID, maintain vital public services, even amid declines in revenue, and build a strong, resilient, and equitable recovery by making investments that support long-term growth and opportunity. Now, the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act that I'll discuss later provides far more dollars for horizontal infrastructure than ARPA, but it has similar goals. Now, the FR, it's to be implemented within the next 48 hours. However, if your government has been following the IFR, then as long as your government is consistent with the provisions of the IFR, your government is in compliance. but you have to have been following the IFR. It's okay to early implement the final rule, but again, by my watch, you have less than 48 hours to do it. So why bother? Yeah, you might as well just get going. Okay, so let's take a quick tour around the four major categories, eligible uses of ARPA funds. These four eligible use categories of ARPA funds and the Fiscal Recovery Fund are to replace lost public sector revenue, using the funding, providing government services up to the amount of the revenue lost during the pandemic. And it's also one of the biggest changes in the final rule is here. And we're going to talk about that big change in a little bit. The next piece is to support the COVID-19 public health and economic response by addressing COVID-19 and its impact on public health, as well as addressing economic harms to households, small businesses, not-for-profits, impacted industries, by the way, the public sector. The third leg is to provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work and offering additional support to those who have and will bear the greatest health risks because of their service in this critical sectors. And there is a new framework we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then finally, the fourth leg is to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, making necessary investments to improve access to clean drinking water, to support vital wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, and to expand affordable access to broadband internet. So let's delve a little bit deeper into these categories. Again, there's more to this in the final rule, but as an overview, for the replacement of public sector revenue to fund services, recipients may use funds up to the amount of revenue lost for government services. Generally, services traditionally provided by governments are government services unless the Treasury has stated otherwise. The final rule generally aligns to what is shown in your annual financial report as your government services, including general government, education, public safety, and so on, unless there is a specific exclusion in ARPA. Now, to support the public health and economic response, the goal is to address COVID-19 and its impact on public health, as well as addressing economic harms to households, small businesses, not-for-profits, impacted industries, and the public sector. And that last piece is what a lot of people sort of gloss over, is there is funds strictly for the public sector. Again, there's a ton of guidance coming up later in this webinar. For the premium pay provisions, there's a brand new framework, which is important to follow. But the goal remains the same as to what was in the IFR. I have to put down my polling question here. The goal remains the same as to what's in the IFR, to provide premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work, offering additional support to those who have and will bear the greatest health risks because of their service in these critical sectors. Finally, the investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure in the final rule, there is now a direct link to the existing EPA program guidance for state revolving funds for clean water and drinking water. And for those of you who follow federal grants, we're talking about grant award number 66.458 and 66.468 from EPA. The eligible uses in those grants have been broadened in the final rule. For broadband, the goal is to fund high-speed infrastructure in areas that need that the recipient identifies are in need, such as areas without access to adequate speeds, affordable options, or where connections are inconsistent or unreliable. Completed projects must participate in a low-income subsidy program. You may have received outreach from your broadband provider saying that you may be eligible for a $30 subsidy for your household if you qualify. Now, that subsidy is part of the American Rescue Plan, and it's part of this leg for broadband infrastructure. Okay, Under ARPA, funds must be used for costs incurred on or after March 3rd of 2021. Further, the funds must be obligated, meaning budgeted but not required to be spent by December 31st of 2024, but they have to be spent by December 31st, 2026. Now, this period during which recipients can expend funds from ARPA, that is the period of performance. And those dates are vital. Dog ear this page. It is vital to remember those dates. We get tons of questions on the word obligation and what does it mean. Treasury's final rule provides that incurred means that the recipient has incurred an obligation, which has the same meaning given to financial obligation in the Uniform Guidance. The Uniform Guidance defines financial obligations as when referencing a recipient's or subrecipient's use of funds under a federal award. And that means orders placed for property and services, contracts and subawards made, and similar transactions that require payment. Now, to be obligated by December 31st of 2024, an order must have been placed, a contract made, or a transaction must have been incurred. Now, the word expended is different. Completion of the obligation through a cash outflow that was placed, contract made, etc. In that case, you have to have that done by December 31st of 2026. Now, for many governments, funds must be obligated by now. And the key then will be that spending date. But we have over maybe 3+ years left on that. So, you do have some time, but that word obligation really is key. We also received tons of questions on the general operations of ARPA. Now, these first two, loosen up because there's a major change that's about to go on. Now, the first question is, what is a DUNS number and why is it important? Now, those of you who are metropolitan cities and non-entitlement units of local government, you have to have a valid DUNS number to meet the reporting requirements in the fiscal recovery funds. Now, a DUNS number is a unique 9-character number to identify your organization, and it's issued by Dun & Bradstreet. Now, the federal government uses the DUNS number over the next few days to track how federal money is allocated. And notice I said over the next couple of days. Now, a DUNS number is required prior to registering in the SAM database, which is the second question. And registering for a DUNS number is free of charge, but that said, DUNS numbers may be established without regard or knowledge of other DUNS numbers in your government. And your government may have tons of DUNS numbers already. And, back in the day when the Recovery Act was passed back in 2008, and it was among the first requirements of a DUNS number. And I was a preparer back then in charge of my state's single audit and so on. So I said, just for laughs, I'm going to go register for a DUNS number. And I called myself Mickey Mouse. And sure enough, I got a DUNS number. And so somewhere floating around the Dun & Bradstreet system, there was a registration for Mickey Mouse in Boston, Massachusetts. So not a lot of internal controls on DUNS numbers. Now, the second piece we get a lot of questions on, what is this thing called SAM? And again, for another few days, SAM is the official government-wide database to register with, to do business with the US government. And all federal assistance recipients must register on sam.gov and renew their registration annually, again, just for the next few days, and to be eligible to receive federal financial assistance. And this is a free registration and a free re-registration, of course. Now, you need, if you happen to be a metropolitan city or an NEU or any other government, you got to have a SAM registration to receive funds. And you got to do it through the Treasury portal. Now, if you haven't registered with sam.gov, you may have to do so to receive your award, and certainly before the submission of the mandatory reporting coming up next month. Now, if you don't have an active SAM registration, I would probably go to the sam.gov website just to see if you do. Now, here's the big change, folks. Starting April 4th, and that's next week, the unique entity identifier number will be the single ID for all federal funding opportunities. My registration for Mickey Mouse, that's being stopped in the DUNS system. The federal government will stop using the DUNS numbers to uniquely identify entities. At that point, entities doing business with the federal government will use the UEI, that unique entity identifier that SAM created in sam.gov. They will no longer have to use this third-party website to obtain their identifier. Now, there is a transition process that's going on, but the process will allow the government to streamline the identification and validation process and making it easier and less burdensome for your entity to do business. Now, this integrated award environment manages a whole bunch of systems within SAM. And again, if you're registered in SAM, you already have a UEI. And if you don't know what it is, ask somebody who does. And you can even, there's probably a customer service or general email address that you can ask them as to what is your UEI. This is a great time to clean up your registrations. If you have some time, sign into your SAM account to clean this up. And again, this starts all next week, as if you have nothing else to do. Now, another FAQ we receive is whether the government, your local government, say your state governor or your state legislature, can interfere with allocating or spending COVID funds at NEUs. And the answer is no. A state cannot impose stricter limitations as permitted by, other than permitted by statute or Treasury regulations or guidance on NEUs for fiscal recovery funds. You can't do that. It's basically just pass through funds. And as long as there's a spending plan that's established, and as long as you adhere to what's in ARPA, again, the funds are just pretty much passed through. Further, states and territories may not provide funding on a reimbursement basis to these NEUs or local governments to pay for project costs up front before being reimbursed by fiscal recovery fund payments. Because this funding model would not comport to the statutory requirement that states and territories make distributions to local governments within the statutory timeframe. Now, finally, we get tons of questions on administrative costs. Well, yeah, folks, funds may be used to pay for administrative costs, including payments to consultants and payroll to assist with the implementation of ARPA projects. Now, this includes the cost of consultants, including to Kurt and me at Eide Bailly, to ensure effective project management, as well as legal and regulatory compliance. Funds may be used to increase staff capacity and to stabilize your operations. Now, there are other programs in ARPA, and we get tons of questions on the capital projects piece and whether or not there is written justification required to the U.S. Treasury for the project. Now, for ease of administration, the final rule identifies the enumerated types of capital expenditures that Treasury has identified as responding to the pandemic's impacts. And these include and are listed as in the applicable subcategory of eligible uses, including public health, assistance to households, and so on. Recipients may also identify other responsive capital expenditures like other eligible uses in the program. And no pre-approval is required for most capital expenditures. To guide your analysis of whether a capital expenditure meets the eligibility standard, recipients, except for tribal governments, must complete and meet the requirements of a written justification for capital expenditures equal to or greater than $1 million. For large-scale capital expenditures, which have high costs and may require an extended length of time to complete, as well as most capital expenditures for non-enumerated uses of funds, The Treasury requires recipients to submit their written justification as part of their regular reporting, which again will start next month. So, just to summarize this, if your project has total capital expenditures of less than $1 million, no written justification is required. Now, if your project is greater than 1 million but less than 10 million, a written justification is required, but recipients are not required to submit that as part of their regular reporting to the Treasury if the use is enumerated by the Treasury as eligible. But if the use is not enumerated by the Treasury as eligible in the fiscal recovery funds, well, then the project amount above that 1 million, or a project that's above that 1 million but less than 10 million, there is a written justification that's required that should be submitted to the Treasury, but it's unclear as to what the Treasury is going to be using with this. Now, let's say the use was enumerated by the Treasury as part of the final rule, and it's more than $10 million. Well, then again, the written justification is required and it has to be submitted along about April 30th as part of your report. But again, there's no real guidance as to what they're going to do with this. There is guidance within the final rule as to what's included in the written justification and how it's submitted. And effectively what it is it's attached to, your final report and uploaded. And Kurt and I can help you with that as well as the rest of our ARPA team. So what is different in the final rule from the interim final rule? One that's a major deal and a huge administrative relief, but also with a huge asterisk. And a question I get every single day is that, is that government recipients may elect a standard allowance of $10 million to spend on government services through the period of performance. So we're talking all the way till December 31st of 2026, instead of doing that real kludgy revenue loss calculation from the interim final rule. Under this option, the Treasury presumes that up to $10 million in revenue has been lost due to the public health emergency, and recipients are permitted to use that amount, not to exceed that amount, to fund government services. The standard allowance provides an estimate of your revenue loss that is based on Treasury's analysis of average revenue loss across states and local governments. And this is really a simple, convenient way to determine revenue loss, particularly for you very small recipients that are less than $10 million in ARPA awards. Now, all recipients may elect to use this standard allowance instead of calculating lost revenue using the formula, including those with total allocations of, again, $10 million or less. But here's where the asterisk comes in, folks. And it's a big asterisk. Electing the standard allowance does not increase or decrease your total allocation of ARPA funds. Again, once the allowance is gone, it's gone. Once you've spent your total ARPA funds, they're gone. And so the allowance is only up to the amount of your ARPA award, and that really is it. So let's say your government received $4 million in ARPA, and your standard allowance is only up to 4 million and not up to 10 million. Well, guess what, folks? You do not receive an additional $6 million. And I get a question about that at least twice a week. So again, if you receive $4 million and your standard allowance is $10 million, you don't receive 10, you receive 4, and that's it. Now, for some governments, depending on your revenue flow during a year and your sources of revenue, and the revenue loss calculation may be more beneficial. And I hear that from a lot from practitioners that depending on which way your revenue works, and actually even which jurisdiction you're in, your revenue loss calculation under the interim final rule may actually work out in your favor. Further, you do not need to use the entire standard allowance. You can break it up into pieces each year in ARPA as long as you tell the Treasury what you're doing. And of course, once you hit your cap of your ARPA funds, it's gone. So let's delve a little bit deeper into the revenue loss calculation, as there is further relief in the final rule. Okay, here. Okay. All right. So your calculation is now, this is a major change. Your calculation is now going to align to your fiscal year. Happy days, everybody. No more trying to offset to December 31st if that is not your fiscal year. But you can still use the old calculation if you desire, as long as it's consistently applied. So you got to figure this out pretty quick, especially since the report is due in about 30 days. Figure out where you're going to do things. Are you going to use your fiscal year, or are you going to use the IFR definition? My advice to you, probably use whatever your audit period is. That means your fiscal year. Now, under this option, recipients calculate revenue loss at 4 distinct points in time, either at the end of each calendar year. So, again, we're doing 10 times for the normal mind, 100 times under stress here. The end of the calendar year, that's December 31st for those of us who are still counting. December 31st for, in this case, years 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and so on. Or you can use the end of each fiscal year of your government. Under the flexibility provided in the final rule, recipients can choose whether to use, again, the calendar year or the fiscal year dates, but you got to be consistent all the way until December 31st of 2026. Now, Treasury has also provided several adjustments to the definition of general revenue in this final rule. To calculate the revenue loss at each of these dates, recipients, you got to use a 4-step process. The first being calculating your base year revenue, which entails measuring revenues collected in the most recent fiscal year, actually the full fiscal year, I apologize, prior to the public health emergency. Now, the last full fiscal year before January 27th, 2020, which is when the emergency was declared, for June 30 governments, now that would be from July 1st of 2018 through June 30 of 2019, or as I like to call it, 1 year BC, 1 year before COVID. So that was 1 year BC, and you should have your audit pretty completed by now for your June 30, 2019 audits. And so there's your revenue calculation for the most part, with certain adjustments that the US Treasury is going to require you to do. Now, next, the estimation of contrafactual revenue, it's the same in the IFR. And I know contrafactual, that's a hard word to understand, but I'm going to explain it in layman's terms in a little bit. Now, this revenue is equal to the formula that is on the screen there. And again, you're going to have your handouts emailed to you. So just use this formula. And N is the number of months elapsed since the end of the base year, which we just went over, to the calculation date. But there's this huge difference in the final rule. Now, Treasury is realizing that we have this thing called inflation, and they raised the ceiling from 4.1% to 5.2%. Now, this means there's a greater chance of lost revenue, and it's why we say that you may just want to run the numbers, and that 4.1% versus 5.2%, that means that you have more room to declare a loss. Again, the growth adjustment is the greater of this standard growth rate, which is 5.2%, or whatever your average annual revenue growth is in the last 3 fiscal years prior to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And again, if you're a June 30 government, well, that means June 30, 2017, 2018, and 2019. Now, next, you subtract your actual revenue, just take it out of your audited financial statements for the 12 months prior to when that calculation date, which means your fiscal year end, if you're using a fiscal year and not a calendar year. But there is a further change in the final rule, which your governing body may not appreciate. Under the final rule, recipients, you gotta adjust your actual revenue totals for the effect of tax cuts and tax increases that are adopted after January 6th of 2022, when the final rule was adopted. Now, specifically, the estimated fiscal impact of tax cuts and tax increases adopted after January 6th of 2022, well, they got to be added or subtracted to the calculation of actual revenue for the purposes of the calculation dates that occur on or after April 1st of 2022. And now recipients may subtract from the calculation of actual revenue the effect of tax increases enacted prior to the adoption of the final rule. That means what's done is done. But if you do that election, you must also remove the effect of the tax decreases enacted before the adoption of the final rule, such that they are accurately removing the effect of tax policy changes on revenue. And certainly, you may have seen in the news over the past few weeks, states enacting tax decreases, and that's great. Now, for a lot of us, especially with inflation going on. However, for the purposes of this calculation, you're going to end up reporting them to the US Treasury. And guess what? That's going to decrease your allowable revenue loss if you do this calculation. So just, if you do get that question, if you're a preparer and you get a question from your legislative folk or your governing folk, and they say, gee, we want to do a great tax credit. Okay, that's great in doing it. But in this reporting, remember, it's got to be reported to the US Treasury. Okay, now that you have a wider quarter to create revenue loss, what can you use it on? Well, recipients can use the fiscal recovery funds on government services up to that revenue loss amount, whether that be the standard allowance or the amount calculated using the formula. And government services generally, again, include any service traditionally provided by the government, unless Treasury has stated otherwise. Now, these are there's a common list that common examples that are on the screen, although this is certainly not all exhaustive. Treasury knows that in its printed copy of its guidance, it made a huge error, by the way, and they've been saying this in webinars. They forgot to include the word schools in there. And they're stating publicly that, yeah, they messed up. And indeed, you can use the revenue loss for schools. Now, of course, that is usually a general government service for many of you that may be on the webinar. Now, we do receive tons of frequently asked questions on the revenue loss calculation, and probably the most questions we receive is on the revenue loss calculation. Now, the first, again, here we have a government that's asking about the $10 million allowance. Can we use it to modernize our jail? And the answer is potentially, as long as the amount is used for federally eligible purposes in ARPA. Again, government services, combating the virus, public safety, all or some of those funds could be eligible. And there may need to be written justification, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, for the capital outlay, especially if it goes, over $1 million. And here it's $10 million. Another one we have received more than a few times is, gee, we want to remodel a government building, in this case, a courthouse, using the standard allowance. Now, if the procurement for construction for, in this case, the courthouse is performed within the provisions of the uniform guidance and reporting is made per the ARPA reporting guidance and the costs are federally eligible, well, guess what, folks? It's probably okay. Another is claiming that the entire, 10 million, as the standard allowance. And again, we get this a lot. And I can't emphasize this enough. Once it's spent, it's gone. And there are no further funds from ARPA. And again, it has to be spent on eligible services and allowable costs in accordance with ARPA. Now, finally, we've received questions on paying payroll and salaries and so on from the revenue loss. As long as the funds are there for government services, then it really would appear that most payroll items provided in the question would be eligible uses under the revenue loss category. But again, you got to think about the employees that are being paid. Are those employees already federally eligible? And if they are, then should be okay. If they're not federally eligible, you might run into a little bit of a problem. Okay, Kurt, what about some of the other eligible uses of ARPA funds and the expansions within the final rule?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eric. So, Eric just kind of covered lost revenue, general services, and did a very high level. But there's a couple of questions that have come in, and I typed the answers, but I just want to clarify that the lost revenue and the standard allowance is just one of the 4 buckets, right? So if you take the standard allowance, that's great. That's your cap on what you can count or allocate or obligate towards lost revenue and general services. But we've got this one here, supporting the COVID-19 public health and economic response. We're going to go over premium pay, and we've got infrastructure. So I'm going to cover the other 3 buckets. And remember, you just need to use the money on one of the 4. So lost revenue, standard allowance, or if you do your own calculation to be higher than the 10 million, that's just one of the 4. Now we're going to cover the other 3. So supporting the COVID-19 public health and economic response, this is what I like to think of kind of just internally in the back of my mind is kind of the carryover from CRF. Many of you are probably familiar with the Coronavirus Relief Fund, right? That's the CARES Act dollars, and this is ARPA versus the CARES Act. But if you think about what the CARES Act was, that was really direct response to the pandemic, right? Public health emergency. How do we directly respond to that? This bucket is very similar to that. They just added kind of the economic impact on top of that because they said, well, we're still responding to the public health emergency and everything that needs to be done there. Some jurisdictions are recovering a little bit faster than others. We need to have some sort of economic response. So this bucket, again, not perfect, but I like to think of it as, very similar to CRF. So what can these funds be used for? What's the justification behind it? Well, public health or economic harms. And that at the very high level is what they're for. Now, it should be kind of focused on households, small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, or governments. It really should be kind of tried to, or at least focused on disproportionately impacted classes, right? What do I mean by that? Groups of people, areas of business, industries, those type of things, right? Disproportionately impacted. So the final rule, there were a lot of questions in the interim final rule that said, what the heck does all this mean? Final rule came out with some simplification and said, okay, an industry is presumed to be impacted if the industry experienced employment loss greater than 8%. That is quite a few industries, depending on the state that you live in. I'm from Reno, Nevada. We had huge unemployment. We had a lot of industries, especially in the hospitality, that had a significant amount of employment loss. There's a lot of different areas that had employment loss, but it's measured from 3 months prior to March 2020, and then seasonally adjusted. There are some other alternatives available, or that may be available. They're enumerated in the final rule. Encourage you to dig into that if you've got significant questions on this area. And kind of what's the process? Well, identify the public health or the economic impact on a group or class or business or nonprofit. Kind of figure out what's the impact. Design a program that responds to that, and move forward and implement it. And now we'll go over a couple of examples just to kind of show what I mean by that, or in the next few slides anyway. So here is a tool available from the US Treasury to determine low and moderate income, for example, right? So if we're thinking about disproportionately impacted classes, well, low and moderate income thresholds is certainly one of them. Low income persons were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Treasury has published this tool kind of in concert with HUD and HHS, and it's available for basically every county in the country. And you simply go to this website, click on the Excel, start filtering, and as you can see right here, we're just using Orange County, California as an example. And they tell you for a household size of 3, if their income's under 48,440, they're considered low income. If it's a household size of 3 and they're under 78,715, that's moderate income. So there are tools available for those of you who are wondering, how the heck do we determine low and moderate income? You can use this tool that Treasury's made available to provide assistance with that. Here are some COVID-19 prevention and mitigation enumerated uses. So if we think about prevention and mitigation, this falls under the public health response, right? We've got public health and economic impact. This is the public health piece of it. And again, this is not exhaustive, but these are what the final rule has said as examples. So vaccine programs, testing equipment, site costs. I'm not going to go through all of these. PPE, of course, ventilators and ambulances, technical assistance. The big one that we get a lot, paid family and medical leave, treatment rooms, temporary medical facilities, behavioral health care, technology and enforcement efforts, et cetera, et cetera. There's quite a few prevention and mitigation uses here. I mean, it's not, Treasury can't think of every single possible use under the sun and put it all into the final rule, but they can kind of provide a guide, a baseline to say, hey, these are the types of programs that we're thinking about as prevention and mitigation. This is, responding to the public health. If it's not listed here, use some judgment. Is it in the same vein? Can you justify that it's prevention and mitigation? Look at examples here and then go forward. So I think these should be pretty straightforward, I hope, to most of you when thinking about these type of direct responses. But again, not all exhaustive. So now when we think about, well, remember, we want disproportionately impacted classes, groups. Let's think about pandemic impact on communities. What about food assistance and food banks, emergency housing, health insurance coverage, survivor benefits, job programs, et cetera, financial services, learning loss, childcare. If we think about a lot of these, a lot of them impact low and moderate income families more than others. It may affect whole entire communities. Again, disproportionately impacted. One here is, it's it's kind of interesting that they put it on impact on communities. It's really more of an impact on the state, but certain contributions to the unemployment trust funds, there was, as many of you know, a significant amount of unemployment claims made during the pandemic. A significant amount of them were fraudulent, but beside the point, there were still a lot of unemployment claims, and many funds, many state trust funds ran out of money, had to borrow money from the feds, from the federal trust fund, to be able to pay those unemployment claims. And they entered into letters of credit essentially, and got advanced monies. These loans could have been huge. We're talking big dollars. Some of those ARPA can be used to help replenish the UI trust fund. There's a couple of certain rules in there, but the common one is repaying that federal advance or that federal loan for the state trust funds that essentially ran out of money. Very common one that we've seen. You know, more examples of how to support public health and the economic response. Again, if there's health disparities, helping community health workers, removal of lead paint, additional medical facilities. We just talked about households and low income, moderate income households. You can do voucher programs, mortgage assistance programs, utility assistance programs, certain counseling, housing navigation assistance. If you're trying to encourage healthy communities and you want people to get outdoors more and responding to public health and all the factors there, parks and green spaces, sidewalks and crosswalks, healthy food access, you know, looking at vacant and abandoned properties for people that, you know, just had to walk away during the pandemic because they were laid off. So rehab and renovation that can be used to assist there, or title acquisition and fees, demolition, etc. Think about educational disparities on especially low-income areas, but resources for high poverty districts. What about tutoring and after-school programs, new construction? You know, I think the common one that is really easy for many jurisdictions across the country to think about is small business assistance. We saw a lot of small business programs where they were either loans or grants, like, hey, if you're a small business and you're trying to stay open, under CRF, there were a lot of grants that were made to small businesses. You know, those small business programs can continue under ARPA. Again, thinking about economic response, technical assistance, etc. Nonprofits struggled mightily because they couldn't hold their fundraisers anymore. A lot of them are still recovering from that. So economic response, thinking about nonprofits, how to assist those. Again, still wanting to try to focus on disproportionately impacted, but you know, this is the economic response vein. Of course, travel, tourism, and hospitality, those are the three big ones that were impacted, but it's not just those three. Remember from a couple slides ago, if you have an industry that had greater than 8% unemployment or during the covered period, those are impacted industries as well. You can help with payroll costs or compensation, technical assistance. Sure, you can do, you know, kind of combine the small business loans or grants in those industries as well, get 2 for 1. Public sector capacity and workforce. Now, this was a big one. We're going to cover it quite a bit on the next slide here. But what Treasury has recognized and realized is that governments, most of you on the phone, there is a significant struggle with maintaining or growing workforce. The Great Resignation, you know, and the baby boomers leaving the workforce, that was all greatly accelerated due to the pandemic. Governments are struggling to maintain FTE levels or higher. We're going to talk about on the next slide a public sector capacity formula that is available in the final rule. So the first step is to gather your budgeted FTEs as of January 27th of 2020. And again, it's budgeted FTE, so filled and unfilled positions. And as an example, we'll use 1,000. You multiply that baseline by 7.5%. So in this case, we're at 1,075. And then gather your budgeted FTEs, again, filled and unfilled, as of March 3rd, 2021. That's the date that ARPA was enacted. And then you can exclude if you hired any FTEs or created FTEs that were dedicated to responding to the COVID-19 emergency, right? That's not going to count against you. So in our example here, let's say 800 FTEs as of March 3rd, 2021. For this particular government, they implemented quite a bit of budget cuts during the pandemic because they were worried about lost revenue and everything like that. So they slashed budgets and went down to 800 FTEs. 50 of those were responding to COVID-19. And essentially you subtract 3 from 2. And again, if you take out the 50, you'd be at 325 positions can be funded by ARPA. Now there's a couple of cautions here. One is ARPA will run out at some point. So you can initially fund those with ARPA, hire those positions. You're going to have to figure out how to pay for them once ARPA's spent. It's got to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, spent by December 31st, 2026. You do have a few years to figure out how to fund them, though. They still need to be eligible employees. And eligible means public safety, public health, human services, or some sort of supporting employee, or retention for public sector workers. Again, the focus is on response to the public health emergency. Still have to follow uniform guidance cost principles regarding compensation, meaning still needs to be fair compensation. You can't provide crazy benefits. It still needs to be reasonable for the position and the industry and the location that you're in. ARPA, the final rule does encourage diversity in the hiring practice. And you may also have premium pay, which we'll cover in a few slides. But it's Treasury's recognition that governments are really struggling with keeping FTEs. You can certainly go through this calculation, justify those positions, try to recover back to pre-pandemic or inflate the growth factor of that 7.5%. Try to get some back. Just the caveat of you have a couple of years to figure out how you're going to fund them once ARPA runs out. Okay, we get a couple of FAQs on eligible uses, quite a bit. And so the first one, and especially over capital assets, we would like to use ARPA funds to purchase an ambulance. We believe this qualifies under responding to the public health crisis and will improve our response to the pandemic. Is that allowable? So an ambulance purchase was on the enumerated list by Treasury in the final rule. Chances are you're perfectly fine. Our only caveat is to make sure you still follow the capital expenditure rules that are listed in the final rule. And the reason I'm not going into that in detail is there's like 30 pages of final rule on capital projects alone. But for the most part, yes, you will be able to purchase an ambulance. You're justifying that it's a use to respond to the public health crisis and that you need an additional ambulance because of XYZ, and then you move on. Are the new self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBAs, purchases eligible for ARPA money? Yes, again, those are very similar to the ambulance answer. Those are listed as an enumerator use. They are usually being purchased for first responders, like firefighters or paramedics, et cetera, et cetera. They're being purchased for your public health employees to combat the direct public health crisis of COVID-19. Again, most likely, yes, provided you follow certain restrictions on the capital projects, but not a big deal. May our government upgrade IT cabling, equipment, voice over IP phone systems to improve the public's access to communications with our offices and our delivery of services via our cloud-based software systems. So yeah, this is a little bit trickier. This one, if you can argue and show that it's meant to be related to the public access response, and you can, clearly show that, then you're probably fine to use it in this category. However, this one might be easier to say, hey, this is a governmental general service, and put that in your lost revenue bucket, just because this one, it's kind of hard sometimes to justify or show that, upgrading IT cabling, equipment, voice, is that going to increase public access for low income communities? I don't know that, you know what I mean? Like trying to prove that or justify that gets a little tricky. So then you're like, okay, let's just put it in the lost revenue and be safe. But could potentially go either way there. Next slide, Eric. Oh, there we go. Another FAQ. Do you have any guidance on how to handle pay for employees that must stay home due to having COVID or a family member having COVID? Can the board request proof of vaccine and give those employees wages without using their sick leave and those that are not vaccinated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So paid family and sick leave is an allowable enumerated use of the of this bucket, of this right, responding to the public health. So yes, certain types of leave are allowable. Now, can the board request proof of vaccine and give those employees wages without using their sick leave, and those that are not vaccinated would have to use their sick leave? I don't know, you're getting into legal questions there. We get those types of questions a lot. There is one caveat in the final rule, is that you cannot implement any of these programs that encourage non-adherence to CDC recommendations. So if you're implementing a program that encourages people, regardless of what, I'm not making any public state or a political statement here, I'm just saying this is in the final rule. If you're implementing any program that encourages people to not wear masks or not get vaccinated, since those are against the CDC guidelines, then that is an unallowable use. Basically, the Treasury and the feds did not want ARPA money being used to counter CDC guidelines. So keep that in mind. Okay, premium pay. So again, Eric's covered lost revenue and standard allowance, governmental services. We just went over a lot of different uses for public health and the economic impact, disproportionate communities, et cetera, classes. Now let's talk about premium pay. This is the third of 4 allowable buckets. So there's 2 key words that I want to highlight here, and we'll cover a couple FAQs where I think the keywords are being missed. But the keywords are eligible workers and essential work. So please, if you don't get anything out of premium pay other than eligible and essential, probably you're going to be okay the most, more times than not. But remember, eligible and essential, it's not for everyone. So the final rule didn't change a whole lot from the interim final rule as far as the dollar amounts. Can still award up to eligible workers up to $13 an hour in premium pay, right? And this is in addition to the base pay. So, if somebody's making $20 an hour, premium pay can add 13 to that. So they're total compensation would be $33 an hour, right? Okay. It's not to cap it at $13 an hour, but may not exceed $25,000 for any single worker for the entire program. That means if you're running a premium pay program for 3 years, you would have to think about that 25,000 is across the full 3 years. If you're running it, if you're doing a premium pay just for 6 months, because that's what your jurisdiction, that's what your decision makers decided, then you're looking at the 25,000 across that 6-month time period. But whatever that premium pay time period that you determine is, or that your decision makers determine, the 25,000 is the cap across that entire time period. Now, they need to be working in key economic sectors and working below a wage threshold or non-exempt from FLSA for overtime. So we're going to go over these. We're going to go through the step process, but it's essentially identify the workforce, remember eligible. Then it's, do they perform the essential work? So those are the 2 key questions, eligible and essential. And then the third one is confirming previous pay response to the worker performing essential work during the pandemic. So again, we'll go over this on the next slide. Okay. So here is a list of eligible workers per the final rule. Healthcare, emergency response, sanitation, disinfection, cleaning, maintenance, grocery stores, pharmacy, research, behavioral health, medical, family care, social services, election, laundry, dental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What do all of these have in common? They're public facing, right? Public facing. So what Treasury is trying to highlight here is that these are positions that had to go on during the pandemic. They were public facing, they were critical. Yes, all of us like to think our positions are critical, and in some ways they are, but with respect to ARPA and the COVID-19 pandemic, they're not. Let's face it, healthcare definitely critical. Grocery stores, all of us had to eat. Yeah, those food delivery, those were critical. So here again, list of eligible workers per the final rule, which is quite a bit if you think about it. Next slide, Eric. Now, so let's say we've determined, okay, here's the eligible workforce, here's the eligible kind of industries that have been impacted. And I do want to clarify, because I didn't say it on the last slide, premium pay doesn't have to be held within the government. You can enter into, for example, we'll use grocery as the example. You can partner as the government with your local grocery stores and say, hey, your workers had this great burden placed upon them. We'd like to give them some premium pay. And you partner with that grocery store as the government to provide some premium pay. It's not to say that it can't all be kept in-house with the government, but it's meant to help those workers in these industries out in the community. So please keep that in mind, that you can partner with private businesses here to provide this premium pay. Okay, essential work. So the big caveat, can't be teleworking from a residence. Why? Because they're trying to focus on public facing. All those eligible workers that we just covered are in public facing industries, working with patients, working with the public, trying to feed them, that type of stuff, dental care, whatever. And so, but there's a lot of support to that, right? Like not everybody in healthcare works with patients. Not everybody in grocery stores works with the public. Not everybody in dental care works with the public, et cetera. So they wanted to say public facing industries, and then they have the caveat of essential work involves regular in-person interactions or regular physical handling of items that were handled by or to be handled by patients, the public, coworkers, et cetera. So Unfortunately for all of us accountants that teleworked and worked from home, and we're able to audit, do taxes and audit from home, or still, process accounts payable from home, or whatever that is, we do not qualify. So then the step 3 is confirm that premium pay responds to workers performing the essential work. And so they got pretty smart here. They're like, yeah, let's make sure that somebody doesn't go start working for the grocery store now, but they weren't during the pandemic, so that they can take advantage of the premium pay. So that's kind of that caveat there. But earning with premium pay is included at or below 150% of the state or county's average annual wage for all occupations. The employee can't be exempt from FLSA. If it doesn't meet those criteria, it is required justification to the U.S. Treasury, can be awarded in installments or lump sum, can be awarded retrospectively. So here's a couple of, here's an example. So state of California, the mean wage 65,000 times 150% is 98,000. Right, so that's a difference of 32,000. But it's limited to 25,000 for the entire period of performance. So in this case, the maximum cap is 25,000. Be careful not to use the median wage. And again, make sure that it's paying for workers performing the essential work during the pandemic. That's the key. And these are just some of the caps. Okay, FAQ. I've actually seen this one quite a bit. Obviously, that's what a frequently asked question means, but it surprised me how many times I get this question. And it says, our governing board has decided to give all the government employees hazard pay without regard to who is an essential worker. Will ARPA cover the hazard pay? Other versions of this I see is, is this premium pay? Is it hazard pay? Is it a bonus? Like, is it taking the place of collective bargaining? Like, there's a lot of different nuances to this that we get the type of question. But again, we just went over that it has to be eligible and essential. And my gut feeling is telling me that not every single employee in the government is eligible and essential, meaning is every employee in the government dealing with the public. And in those, kind of healthcare, well, not necessarily healthcare, but in those eligible enumerated industries, I'm going out on a limb and saying probably not. Now, maybe you work for a small government that just so happens to be completely public facing, then great, you're lucky. So I would bring this up to your governing board if they're trying to do just a full blanket policy that eligible and essential, unless you can justify all of that, probably will be in non-compliance there. Okay, so moving on to investments in infrastructure, specifically water and sewer and broadband. Now this is basically the fourth allowable bucket of obligations or justification, however you want to talk about it. And go ahead to the next slide, Eric. And so luckily, there's already quite a bit of guidance out there on eligible uses, as already contained, as Eric mentioned earlier, in the revolving funds, right? In your clean water, in your drinking water revolving loan funds, very common, almost every state has them. And Treasury just said, hey, look to the eligible uses in the revolving funds. Those are basically all eligible under ARPA as well, because they're looking at critical infrastructure, right? If you're trying to make sure you have clean water or drinking water, that's critical infrastructure. We've had a pandemic, people are impacted. What are examples of these eligible projects? Construction of treatment works, that's usually really expensive. I think in our jurisdiction, you know, when I see sewer projects like this, we're looking at $50 million projects, 100 million, $150 million projects. Your ARPA money will go very quickly if that's what you're using it on. Decentralized wastewater treatment systems, construction upgrades, repairs, stormwater. We'll go over a couple FAQs on stormwater in a bit, but stormwater is an allowable use. Water conservation and efficiency, reuse and recycling of basic wastewater, stormwater, etc. New facilities to improve drinking water quality, green infrastructure, water storage, etc. Lead service line replacement. All of these are already allowable in the state revolving funds. And normally you end up partnering with the state revolving loan fund. You get a loan from the state and you implement one of these projects. However, now you can use your ARPA money directly on these projects without having to partner with the loan fund or use it as a loan. It's just a grant. So a benefit to those communities. Now, there's a couple of new eligible uses that the final rule enumerated. A couple additional on lead remediation, testing, faucets, fixtures in schools and childcare facilities. They enhanced and added even more stormwater examples for infrastructure, including culvert repair, resizing and removal, replacement of storm sewers, etc. Residential wells was added there. Dam and reservoir rehab. Again, they really tried to expand the eligible uses of water and sewer. Stormwater is in there because stormwater gets kind of, depending on the jurisdiction, those are generally implemented in with a wastewater treatment, and they're combined, and it's hard to like separate the two. So stormwater is basically included with wastewater and drinking water, just because, you know, depending on the jurisdiction, it's hard to separate out all of those activities. So the one that's harder, and again, the reason it's harder because the EPA and the revolving funds already have all of this guidance out there on all of these projects, and they've been around for many, many years. And then they threw broadband in there, and they're like, okay, well, what are we trying to do with broadband? We don't have a broadband revolving loan fund. So what do we do? So it's a three-step process clarified in the final rule. One is to identify an eligible area. And what are they trying to focus on? They're trying to focus on areas that don't have access to 100 megabytes per second download and 20 megabytes per second upload speeds, right? So they're looking for areas, communities that essentially don't have access to reliable and at least high-speed standards of internet. And that's what they're hoping for. Now, as you all know, there are certain areas of the country and remote areas of the country that would be very, very, very difficult to get to 100 megabytes per second, 20 megabytes per second upload, you know, depending on elevation, remoteness, you know, if you're out in the woods and boondocks, et cetera, like certain costs of these projects, just it couldn't happen. There is a little bit of flexibility there that if you design the project to meet the high-speed standards as far as scalability goes. So let's say you're in a remote, you're looking at an eligible area in a remote part of the state, and there is no way that the cost can get there to provide 100/20, but you design the project that it could eventually scale there when the technology gets there, then Treasury is allowing for that project to proceed. It does require an enrollment, or the provider anyway, the service provider to enroll in the low income subsidy program. Those two are listed there on the screen. And then there is also cybersecurity funding, and it's cybersecurity funding is actually also in the Jobs Act, which Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, which we will talk about in just a few minutes. So again, broadband, a little bit trickier, but again, just doesn't have the revolving loan fund guidance that the other projects do. Okay, FAQs. Can recovery funds be used for stormwater projects and expenses? Yes, for the most part, they can, because they're commingled in a lot of wastewater projects. It's really hard to kind of separate those out. So in general, yes, stormwater projects are allowable, assuming they're managing, reducing, treating, or recapturing stormwater or subsurface water drainage. That they want to be compliant with the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. So if you're doing any sort of stormwater project in that area, then you'll be fine. Are infrastructure projects subject to the Davis-Bacon Act? For those of you who are not experts on federal compliance and Davis-Bacon Act and what we're talking about, that's prevailing wages. So it's kind of interesting here, and the answer might surprise you. If the project is funded 100% from the local fiscal recovery fund, so 100%, then no, that it is not subject to Davis-Bacon, which is usually quite surprising. However, if your project is being funded from multiple federal sources, so let's say ARPA is going to pay 70% of it, and you're going to use another federal grant program to pay for 30% of it, like some sort of FEMA program or something like that, then Davis-Bacon does apply. So this exception is only on the local fiscal recovery funds. There's also a couple other caveats. Many states may have state prevailing wage laws on public projects. Those are often kind of called like mini Davis-Bacon laws. Those would still be required because you still have to follow state law. And Treasury kind of put a really big asterisk on this and said, look, just because Davis-Bacon technically doesn't apply, they still highly encourage using prevailing wages, or at least really close to that, because the idea is, if you think about it, most of this money, the idea is for economic stimulus, and increasing wages of projects helps contractors, or the employees anyway, for contractors, right? It pumps more money into the economy, into the jurisdiction. It increases wages, generally increases quality. You get a high quality, generally a higher quality project. You get more wages out into the community. They spend more money. It's more economic stimulus. So there's a lot of asterisks. There's a lot of caveats, but technically the auditor is not going to be coming around and saying, where's your prevailing wages if it's 100% spent from the fiscal recovery funds. Okay, so a couple restrictions on ARPA and the final rule, and where this really comes into play a lot is in the lost revenue category, because I think everybody kind of understands, oh yeah, there's going to be restrictions in premium pay, there's going to be restrictions on direct response and economic impact and infrastructure, like everybody gets that, but the lost revenue general governmental services are looked at as kind of, right or wrong, they're looked at as free money that, hey, dump everything into lost revenue calculation and we basically don't have to justify anything and we can move on with life. It's easy. And I'll say it's easier. There's definitely a lot less burden. It's a lot simpler to go that route, but there are still restrictions that are applicable to general governmental services and the revenue loss calculation. For one, Eric did mention the tax, offsets. If your jurisdiction cut property taxes and reduced property taxes, well, you don't get to count that in your lost revenue calculation. For anybody other than tribal nations, you cannot make basically unusual or contributions, to fund the unfunded commitment on pension plans. And what do I mean by that? If you are paying your PERS, your pension plan, and there's an employee withholding or the government's paying for it at all themselves, whichever it is, but if the government's paying pension costs on a paycheck by paycheck or maybe a monthly remittance, whatever it is, and they're paying it on the person's salaries, that's fine. That's pay-go spending. That's normal. That's all okay. But if you're looking at your pension plan and you're like, hey, there's a 30% unfunded liability there, I think we'll just make a one-time contribution of that 30% to become fully funded. That is not allowable. Also cannot be used for debt service. Can't pay off those bonds and stuff that you entered into. Now, the one caveat there is the unemployment trust fund, right? If, like I mentioned earlier, if you went and borrowed from the feds because your state trust fund ran out of money, that debt service is okay. But the debt service we're talking about here is, bonds or leases, et cetera, et cetera. Can't be used for stabilization or rainy day funds. Definitely can't be used for settlements or judgments. So if you have some sort of legal settlement that just happened, can't use it for that. Here's the big one that I was talking about earlier. Cannot be used to implement any sort of program or reward behavior that undermines CDC guidance and recommendations. For example, if the recommendation was to get vaccinated, you cannot implement a program that is rewarding people for being unvaccinated. Okay. Again, political beliefs aside, that's just the rules in the final rule. Also, cannot violate any uniform guidance, conflict of interest requirements, other laws or regulations. That's big, right? You can't be entering into a contract with your sibling that owns the contracting company that you're now building the road with. Like that's, you can't violate conflict of interest, which should have been kind of clear. Matching. So we get this question a lot too. Funds available under revenue loss, right? So if you're saying we're taking the standard allowance or we're taking our own revenue loss calculation, whatever it is, and we're gonna meet general governmental services, can we use the local fiscal recovery funds to meet the match? The answer is sort of generally yes. And what do I mean by that? Well, it can't be used for Medicaid or CHIP. It can't be used for the IIJA. It can't be used on any federal program that expressly prohibits using other federal funds to meet match. So that's like Medicaid and CHIP, for example. It's clear in the guidance that says the local match must come from state resources, not other federal resources. And so it's directly scoped out. Final rule does have some more clarity on this and a list. Now, if you have a federal program that's requiring match and does not scope out other federal programs, then theoretically you can use this to meet your match. I generally see that uncommon though. I think most jurisdictions kind of think about supplementing and supplanting and running programs, and generally if you have a grant program that you've been paying your match on for years, that's already kind of paid for and organized and budgeted for. I think there's probably a lot of easier uses or other uses that you can use the money on without having to justify coming up with match. Just my 2 cents on that. It's probably a lot easier to justify other uses. But anyway, so with that, That is really the 4 buckets of allowable uses of the local fiscal recovery funds. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk about really quickly the reporting guidance on ARPA requirements there, and then into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Well, thank you, Kurt. And again, thank you, everybody. Great job, Kurt. Just real quick, I wanted to get to a few questions. There was a question early on DUNS will no longer be valid and so on. And do we have to use the UEI? And the answer is yes. Essentially, all those systems are being merged by the federal government. So please use the UEI, especially after April 4th. That is next week. A lot of questions on the revenue loss calculation. Again, the rule is that, yes, you can claim up to your entire grant award or $10 million, whichever is less. But again, remember that big asterisk. Once that 10 million or your grant award is gone, the Treasury window is closed. And for those of you who read the newspaper and so on, I doubt the federal government's going to be passing a bill anywhere near this size ever again, at least not in the foreseeable future, for sure. And so just be really prudent on whether or not you use the entire standard allowance up front. And so again, we got a bunch of questions on that. There was a question, and maybe Kurt, you can answer this one. The CARES Act had CFDA number 21.027. What other CFDA numbers should auditors be on the lookout as they pertain to ARP funds? It's still all under the Treasury. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of the ARP dollars are under Treasury, but the ones that aren't under Treasury are generally being kind of additive. So for example, LIHEAP, low income housing assistance or energy assistance, ERAP, emergency rental assistance. There's a lot of supplemental funding that's coming out of ARPA that's being additive to those programs. And we're seeing a lot of grant awards that, say, funded under the American Rescue Plan, especially in the HHS world as well. So it's kind of all over the board. 21.027 is the local fiscal recovery funds. We're seeing additions to ERAP and to low income housing and those other programs. So kind of across the board.
Excellent. And so just one real quick, because we're running out of time. Last point on Davis-Bacon. There's no prohibition from you paying prevailing wage on a infrastructure project. And so if you just want to incorporate it as part of, your contracts for an infrastructure project that's funded by ARPA, be my guest. As long as, again, it's included as part of your reporting, which is what we're about to talk about next. So on reporting, one thing you got to know is that Treasury has updated its reporting guidance. It's on their website, and this next report is due in a little over 30 days. So it's time to get going if you haven't done so already. And very large governments such as states and counties and other entities with awards over 10 million, you've been doing reporting since January. And now it's time for all the rest of us and other entities that have ARPA funds out there to report, including non-entitlement units of government and tribal nations. Now, Treasury's website includes a lot of stuff. It includes templates for reporting for large governments, user guides for non-entitlement local governments, portal instructions, webinars, and other resources, far more than I can do in the next 5 minutes. Remember, if you're in that smaller category, which many of you are, you only have to file annually, and this year's report may not have much in it. but next year's report is going to be pretty detailed. And if you happen to be in the larger government categories, remember that a project expenditure report is due 30 days after each quarter. So you have your report due on that as well. And then a recovery plan performance report is only due every July 31st for those very large governments. So take a look at the guidance from Treasury. It's actually pretty straightforward to go through, and it is in its third printing. Okay, let's do real quick on the Infrastructure Act. This was passed on November 15th of last year, and not a moment too soon. That picture on the right, I actually grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I likely went over that bridge many times, as there was a great playground and a park right near there. And that, bridge went down right before the president was about to speak. So karma. Yeah, don't you think? There are 5 major focus areas in this immense bill on the screen, and the bill was 2,700 pages long. All of this focuses on horizontal infrastructure and eliminating the supply chain bottlenecks. The focus is also going to change the game in funding for Amtrak, which many rural areas depend on, as well as, of course, the East Coast. There's going to be funding for electric vehicle charging stations with a goal of having tens of thousands of more chargers nationally. And that's just $7.5 billion of the act is going to put electric vehicle charging stations all over the country. Another piece is making the electric grid more resilient, diversifying energy resources, including hydro, wind, solar, and protecting the grid against cyber threats. And finally, there's 21 billion included to clean up Superfund sites and capping oil and gas wells. Now, according to a National Association of Counties analysis and confirmed and sort of reviewed by the National Council of State Legislatures, approximately 550 billion in the bill represents new infrastructure investment, with an additional 973 billion over 5 years for existing projects and maintenance. Now, over half that is for the U.S. Department of Transportation and for grants from its various agencies. And the remainder is split between EPA, Commerce, Homeland Security, Energy, Interior, and Agriculture. Now, just to DOT, and most of the funds are for roads and bridges, and your DOTs and DPW know that these funds are coming, and they're smiling all the way to the bank, I bet. Now, in my local paper last week, my state's DOT made the front page of the Metro State section, and they detailed how 9.4 billion of the funds will be used over the next 5 years on projects all over my state. And they were really happy about those funds coming in, but they're also warning everybody you're going to see a lot of those orange barrels out there. But I got to tell you, you can't, anybody who can wield a shovel or pour concrete and so on, you're going to be hired. There's also 25 billion in airport improvement grants. A lot of that's for runways, gates, taxiways, as well as a new airport and terminal improvement program for concessions and multimodal connections. Those of you who fly through the Los Angeles International Airport, a good chunk of those funds are going to be used toward connecting the subway in Los Angeles directly into the airport with a people mover system. And that's kind of really needed if you've ever flown through Los Angeles Airport. And, this improvement is also going to go towards air traffic control infrastructure, some of which, that infrastructure that you see in control towers, and you've seen news reports on it. Some of that infrastructure is over 50 years old, and sometimes they use printed cards to show where takeoffs and landings are happening and handing off from one person to another in the control tower. And those of you who fly, that's a little bit, you get a little bit nervous about that. So just for bridges, your state is going to be busy. a minimum of 45 million per year over the next 5 years to fix bridges allocated based on the amount of bridge inventory. Now, 75% is supposed to go to replace poor bridges, with the remainder going to repair bridges. Now, the remaining 12.5 billion will be available in some form of competitive grants, of which 100 million is set aside for tribal nations to repair bridges just on reservations. Now, some of you may be in Colorado and you may recognize this bridge on Interstate 70. Another 480 bridges in the state are listed as poor, and another 5,000 are in fair condition. Now, if you're in Colorado and you're driving on this bridge, just remember that when you're driving home this evening. But there's other stuff in the IIJA beyond bridges. Again, the competitive grants, they're going to be run by your state DOTs. And again, some of that is based on population. But there's also a provision included to extend the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act of 2000 for another 3 years. Now, what that is the program provides safety net payments from Department of Interior and other agencies to counties, especially for timber and land management. And the proceeds of that is supposed to go to schools. The Infrastructure Act also raises the private activity bond cap to states to allow for broadband companies to use a state's bond cap and borrow at tax exempt rates. It also expands public private partnerships for transportation and carbon capture. Now, the state revolving funds are also recapitalized with nearly 15 billion over 5 years for drinking water and clean water projects. And that's in addition to what's in ARPA. So if you couple what we talked about for over the last hour of water and sewer and broadband in ARPA, and then couple it with the IIJA, it is a waterfall of money available for all of this horizontal infrastructure. Now, 1 billion is also set aside for FEMA for floods, levees, and climate change and resiliency projects, including at Department of Defense sites. You may or may not know that there's a lot of military installations, especially along each coast in the West as well as in the East, that are very vulnerable to climate change and rising sea levels, especially in North Carolina, South Carolina, and so on, Florida. All of that, there's going to be additional funding to secure those bases from flooding, and that's in FEMA money as well as DOD money. There's also a new program at FEMA called STORM, and this will help states establish revolving loan funds that could be used by your local government to carry out mitigation projects that reduce natural disaster risk. And what these are is low interest loans that'll help your local government to invest in resiliency and mitigation projects that help the reduce of, the cost of insurance and disaster recovery payments. Part of the $66 billion in the act for passenger and freight rail is to eliminate at-grade rail crossings. And I know many of your communities may be looking for those funds for sure, because some of those crossings are pretty dangerous, especially when folks try to go around the signals and so on, and unfortunately have an issue. Finally, there's an expansion of Buy America, which, as you know, first appeared during the Great Recession. All of those grants have domestic preference restrictions attached to them. And the IIJA adds more stringent Buy American rules to all federally funded infrastructure and public works projects. So that's a really nice provision for steel workers and iron workers and so on. You got to Buy America if you possibly can. And there's still more in the laundry list, $3.5 billion just this year for weatherization assistance under LIHEAP, as Kurt mentioned, $1 billion annually to modernize the electric grid for climate change, and that'll help folks in the South Central United States. $100 million annually is just in the bill for low income, again, housing energy assistance program. And then there's also cybersecurity. Now, I was at a conference talking with the state of Oklahoma on this one a couple of weeks back, and this is going to be fun for states. Cybersecurity, this is going to be a new grant program that you may be interested in. And there's going to be a total of $1 billion allocated over 4 years, 200 million in FY22, and that's just until September 30th. 400 million in FY23, 300 million in FY24, and 100 million in FY25. And this is in addition to all the other cyber protection programs in the bill. And the goal is to modernize all your systems to provide resiliency. So if you're still using Windows 95 or have floppy disks and things like that, this could be the program for you. Now, there's a required state match that increases each year, but the goal is to provide funds for risk assessment and resiliency against cyber attacks. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is providing these funds, and the allocation is going to be based on population with adjustments for urban versus rural population. And once the state receives the grant, they're going to have 45 days to obligate 80% of the funds to all of you local governments out there. Again, the state has to apply for the grant, and then they have 45 days to send out 80% of that, or actually obligate 80% of those funds. And to apply, they have to match the funds in an increasing amount. Now, if the state does not provide the local governments with funds, well, guess what? Your local government can go directly to the Department of Homeland Security to receive the funds. Now, 25% of the funds to DHS are set aside for rural areas. So if you have not heard from your state as of yet, you may want to ask about this. Now, these are, again, additional cybersecurity dollars, especially for the Department of Energy, for rural electric utilities, and obviously for your general government for cyber incident protection. And so you really want to take a look at this because, if you ask folks who are involved with enterprise risk, it is the #1 issue going on, not only this year, but looking into the foreseeable future. Now, looking at what is excluded from cyber funds in the Infrastructure Act, well, you can't use the federal funds to pay Bitcoin to pay your ransomware. You can't use federal funds for your state match, and you can't use your cybersecurity dollars for cyber stuff. So just a few FAQs on the Infrastructure Act we received. On the state revolving funds under federal law, states are required to deposit some form of cash match into the state revolving funds before applying for the grant. And states also must provide an intended use plan for the list of projects that they're going to be funding with the capitalization grant. Now, the state's cash match, that is going to be 10% for 2022, but no cash match is required for forever chemical remediation, and that's PFAs. Now, the states can issue bonds to provide the 10%, and they have until September 30th of 2023 to provide the match, and 4% is used for administration. And in the spirit of just to expand your knowledge, I used to be the chief financial officer of the program in Massachusetts back in the 1990s. And this is pretty much the same provision that was there when the program started out back in the early 1990s. Now, unfortunately, there are no funds for research and development in manufacturing, housing, schools, businesses, buildings, and home and community-based care. All these are part of ARPA, and actually, Congress, who knows, maybe they'll pass another bill on this one, but I'm not sure I'd count on it. And then finally, on the disaster mitigation, there's 3.5 billion in FEMA money, in flood mitigation to states and local governments, buyouts of local property, elevating properties, meaning physically raising the house or the business. 1 billion in pre-disaster mitigation and 500 million just in the revolving fund. And there's also wildfire mitigation in there as well. So there's lots of stuff in there for FEMA. Okay, and there's even more. Can you use the funds to combat forever chemicals in your water system? Absolutely. 10 billion is available for these to combat the forever chemicals and other contaminants. 1 billion is available through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, all of which are grants. 4 billion is available through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Again, that's at 100% grant. 5 billion is directly available through the states to underserved communities. Can you use this for hydropower? In a lot of our jurisdictions that we do business with, of course, you can. They have hydropower. Yes, 628.6 million is available just in 2022 for hydroelectric, just for counties. 75 million is authorized for efficiency improvement, including turbines. And there's incentive payments in there for capital improvements for hydroelectric grid resiliency, dam safety, electric environmental improvements, and so on. There's brownfield sites, there's energy grants money, there's energy efficiency money available for local education in schools. Those energy efficient funds, you can apply directly to US DOE for improvements, repairs, renovations to schools that directly decrease your energy costs. You can use the funds to improve teacher and student health. You can install alternative fueling infrastructure on school grounds for buses or the public. And you can even procure alternative vehicles for bus fleets and other school-related programs. And in my local jurisdiction, they're all switching over to electric buses because they said, hey, those buses go less than 20 miles a day. We might as well start converting over to electric buses, and they're starting to do that. And so it's not a bad use of the program. So, all right, we're headed towards the top of the hour. I got one more question. Would increased insurance coverage premiums for cybersecurity be eligible? Well, it appears the answer may be yes, but I'd have to do some research on the IIJA. If the person who asked that would just send me an email directly just to remind me on it, I'm going to take a look in the IIJA. It's 2,700 pages long. And I think there is something in there on insurance coverage premiums for cybersecurity. I'd encourage you to actually get cybersecurity insurance. It's actually a pretty good idea. So with that,
hey, Eric, real quick, I just want to add to that maybe a little bit.
Yep.
I would also kind of consider when we're talking about insurance coverage and premiums is that's typically an indirect cost for a lot of jurisdiction organizations and probably already goes through the statewide or the countywide cost allocation plan. And my gut feeling is that it's going to be an allowable indirect cost across, any and all of your grants. So I don't know if it'll be, I don't know if it's going to be a direct cost explicitly under IIJA, or if you would just include it in your indirect cost rate plan and allocate it out. But yeah, it could.
Yeah, it sounds like it's an eligible cost, and so either way, there's probably going to be some federal funding for it, either indirectly or directly. And so again, if you want to send me an email on it, I'm more than happy to take a look for you. Okay, with that, I think we're pretty close to the top of the hour. Amy, take it away. And Kurt, I really want to thank you.
Well, thank you.